Hello and welcome to the first annual Follow Money, Fight Slavery Summit. I'm Sam Graber, Chief Communications Officer for the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative, also known as ATII. ATII helps financial institutions promote their corporate social responsibility through increasing awareness, facilitating intelligence integration and technology advancement, while establishing strategic data collaboration, all focused on one outcome: to combat human trafficking. Now, throughout this summit, you'll hear from industry thought leaders who will discuss the importance of how now more than ever, it's time for financial institutions to take action against human trafficking. Human trafficking is a financial crime, and this is an industry call to action. With me today is Barry Koch, a man whose name comes up often within the human trafficking circles. And that is because he is a consummate thought leader when it comes to the intersection of human trafficking and finance. Now, today he is going to break down for us the F.A.S.T initiative. F.A.S.T is Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking. And in my mind and many others, there is no one better than Barry to take us through this very important exercise, for he was a former commissioner in its creation. Hello, Barry. It's great to see you.
Hey, Sam. Thank you
Hey.
for having me, and thanks for the nice introduction.
Absolutely. Well, I could brag on you all day, but I know people want to see this, so I am going to just hand over the reins to you, sir, and look forward to learning.
Very good.
Awesome.
So thanks again for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. So what is the F.A.S.T initiative? You heard Sam say that it's an acronym, and you can see it on the slides in front of you: Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking. And in order to understand F.A.S.T, you really have to understand what preceded it. And what preceded it was a United Nations affiliated project. And it's got a long name like all the UN projects. It was called the Liechtenstein Initiative for a Financial Sector Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking. And you hear that initiative referred to in a number of different ways. For shorthand, people call it the Liechtenstein Initiative, or they call it the Financial Sector Commission, or they call it the Commission. They all mean the same thing, and I will use those terms interchangeably. But you need to understand how the Commission came about in order to understand F.A.S.T. So some international legal background. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them. It's an interesting read, although way beyond the scope of today's session. They are sustainable goals that were agreed to by all member nations of the United Nations, including the US. There are 17 of them, as I said, and goal number 8, and the compliance date, by the way, is 2030, so there's less than 10 years to eradicate human trafficking and modern slavery and child soldiers and forced labor. But Article 8.7 of the goals refers specifically to eradicating forced labor, ending modern slavery and human trafficking. And in response to calls by the governments of the G7, and you can see that the United States is a member of the G7, many of you know that, and calls by the governments of the G20, and you can see that the US is a member of the G20, as well as the General Assembly resolutions that I mentioned. The Liechtenstein Initiative for a Financial Sector Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking was created. And the initiative is a public-private partnership between the governments of Liechtenstein, Australia, and the Netherlands, as well as the UN University Center for Policy Research, that's the UN's think tank, which acted as the secretariat, and private sector companies, including banks in Liechtenstein and foundations. And the initiative was launched in September of 2018 at the United Nations General Assembly, and the initiative had a one-year mandate. Now, let me start by mentioning that there are many, many stakeholders in the universe of people and organizations committed to combating modern slavery and human trafficking. And you know who these stakeholders are. There's law enforcement, who were focused on investigations and arrests and prosecutions and forfeitures of the traffickers' criminal proceeds. There are the victim service providers and mental health professionals who provide services to survivors. They provide safe houses and counseling and medical care, all of which provide remedy and which reduce the risk of re-victimization. There are legislators who work on providing legal and legislative relief for victims. There are NGOs who deal with the important policy issues affecting victims and anti-trafficking efforts. But among all of these stakeholders, it's the financial sector that finds itself in the unique position of being able to move global economies. It's the finance sector that can and does impact global markets, and it's the finance sector that can and does drive decision-making by sovereign governments. So the finance sector finds itself in a special place when it comes to joining the fight to eradicate trafficking in human beings. And that's what initially led to the creation of the commission. So it was convened by the Prime Minister of Liechtenstein, by the Foreign Minister of Australia, by the Foreign Minister of the Netherlands, and by Professor Muhammad Yunus. Many of you know that name. He won the Nobel Prize for Peace. He created a Grameen Bank some years ago. He's known as the pioneer of microcredit. And what's really fascinating about what he did, what was really, it just changed the landscape. He created a not-for-profit business model for a bank. And the idea was that he would make small microcredit loans to poor women, actually, in Bangladesh. They were typically the equivalent of US $50. And they would use the $50 loans to start up a small business, typically a textile-related business. The idea was that if he could give them seed capital to create these businesses, it could help bring them out of poverty, which in turn, of course, would make them less vulnerable to victimization. 23,000 employees later, with a repayment rate in excess of 98%. Think about that for a not-for-profit bank, a 98% repayment rate. And a Nobel Peace Prize later, he has brought hundreds of thousands of borrowers out of poverty, made them self-sufficient, facilitated their gaining independence and agency, and made them less vulnerable to being exploited and to being trafficked. He was the fourth convener of the commission. You can see here that the commission was chaired by Fiona Reynolds, who is the chief executive officer of the UN-backed Principles for Responsible Investment. I had mentioned before that the UN University Center for Policy Research was the secretariat for the commission. And there are 25 commissioners from around the world. I was one of them. I'm down in the bottom right. You may recognize a few faces among the 25 global commissioners, but the commissioners represented the finance sector. They came from banks, from hedge funds, from pension funds, from anti-slavery NGOs. We had two survivors on the commission. One was a woman who was kidnapped and sex trafficked before she was fortunate enough to escape her traffickers. Another was a fellow who was a child soldier at the age of 8, also fortunate enough after several years to escape his traffickers. But we did have two survivors on the commission. We had representatives from law enforcement and financial intelligence units around the world. We had the head of the Swiss FIU, we had the chairman of the Egmont Group, government development funds, regulators, and representatives from academia. So this next slide, I put it here. It may be that the answer to everybody, hopefully the answer to everybody is the same and it's visceral. Why should we care about this? And hopefully everybody feels that we should care because it's inherently moral. It's the right thing to do. Slavery destroys lives and destroys human potential. But for those of you who may not be persuaded by the moral imperative to end slavery, if you're driven purely by the economics of the issue, then I would suggest to you, I won't suggest, I'll actually present to you, it's factual, there's research to back this up. Trafficking is in the long run economically inefficient. Over time, it is a significant drag on economies and capital markets. So besides doing it because it's inherently worthwhile to end slavery, it's bad for the economy. And that's the global economy. It depresses innovation, it fuels corruption, it fuels illicit financial flows. And I put one statistic here just to give you an example of some of that. In the UK, it is estimated that each case of trafficking costs the government annually a little over £328,000. That's law enforcement costs, medical costs, social services, lost tax revenues, and the like. And in the aggregate, it costs the UK government between 3.3 and 4.3 billion pounds. It is economically inefficient. And so if you encounter the cynics at your financial institutions who want a better reason to end slavery, you can give them the metrics and you can give them the numbers. These are compelling numbers. One last slide with some foundational material before we get right into the Commission's blueprint. So I was asked on a podcast recently when I got involved in the anti-trafficking world, and I thought about it, and it was back when I realized that while slavery is not legal anywhere in the world, it's occurring everywhere in the world. You know, we were taught as we grew up here in the US that slavery ended here in 1863. It didn't. It's still going on. It just looks different. It victimizes more than 40 million people globally. And it's a phenomenon where the world's worst people are profiting from the world's most vulnerable. The 40 million figure, some of you may have heard of a different figure that is talked about, which is approximately 26 million people. The difference, it's not that one is correct and one isn't, the difference of approximately 14 million relates to forced marriages. The international community and various treaties consider those to be inherently coercive relationships, particularly when they're children who are being forced into marriages. They are coercive, they are violations of human rights, and therefore they are considered to be within the force, fraud, and coercion elements of the crime of trafficking, and that's why they're in the 40 million number. If you hear the lower number, it's simply because the person providing the number is excluding those who are prisoners in forced marriage. The global average to buy a human being for forced labor or for sex trafficking is estimated to be $90. You read that again, and it's really just mind-blowing. The global average to buy a human being is $90. Now, it's more in North America and in Europe. It's lower in Africa and Asia, but you can buy a human being for $90. The FATF they've published several reports, but back in 2011, they published these numbers, which are also compelling. $100,000 estimated annual profit per woman in forced sexual servitude, $207,000 estimated annual profit per trafficked child, $26,000 average price to buy a trafficked child in the UK. And what's extraordinary about this, you know, the crime is entirely about greed. It is unlike other crimes in that it is not committed for revenge. It is not committed to make a political statement. It is not committed because somebody's being blackmailed. It is committed because of greed, and it is all about the greed. And I heard a trafficker once say, being interviewed by law enforcement, he was comparing selling drugs to selling girls. And he said selling girls is much better because when you sell the drugs, they're used up after one shot, but you can keep selling the girl over and over again. And that's an extraordinary thing to think about. It's an extraordinary statement. And if you look at these numbers, these actual numbers, you can buy a child for $26,000 in the UK, and after 8 months, you've broken even, and then it's all profit. And when that child gets a little bit older and isn't able to produce as much money as before, begging on the corner, and this is very dark, but many of you who've worked with survivors and worked with victims know that many of the traffickers will then injure the child to make the child a more sympathetic figure to beg for money. But after 8 months, it's gravy. These numbers are extraordinary. $150 billion a year in earnings, US dollars. And so you see how the finance sector is right in the middle of this. And I remember when I was at the bank where we built the very first financial model to identify red flags, we realized that we were not legislators. We couldn't pass laws. We were not law enforcement. We couldn't arrest the traffickers. We were not social workers. We couldn't provide victim services, but we worked at a bank. And if we could figure out where the money was, we could help law enforcement take it away. You've heard some other speakers talk about SAR filings, and you'll hear some of the panel of experts, some of the panels talk about investigations, and you've heard from Homeland Security. Our view was that if we could disrupt the traffickers' business, if we could help law enforcement take away their assets and take away their money, that was the best way for us to fight back. And that is central to the finance community because of these big numbers and because the crime is entirely about the money. So, the Commission had 4 global consultations. You can see in September of 2018, we met in New York after the project was launched at the UN General Assembly. In January of 19, we met in Liechtenstein. We talked about responsible lending and investment practices, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. In April of 19, we met in Sydney, Australia, talked about financial technology, financial inclusion, regulatory models. And then in June of 2019, we spoke about responsible business conduct agreements and sanctions regimes. Many of you who do AML compliance also have some connection to the sanctions compliance programs at your financial institutions. The Commission actually believes, and I personally believe this is right, that there are opportunities for governments like OFAC and OFAC's counterparts in other governments to use the sanctions regime to sanction traffickers. To OFAC's credit, they sanctioned those 6 Libyans back in 2019 who were trafficking in human beings. But there's an opportunity to use the sanctions regime more extensively. And the US has been doing that for human rights violators. There's a long precedent for that. And the Commission in one of its recommendations talks about that. But in June of 2019, we started drafting the blueprint, and you can see the blueprint here. This was released in September of 2019. It is a framework to help the financial sector mobilize to address modern slavery and human trafficking. Technically, the work of the Commission ended on that 1-year anniversary, and that's when F.A.S.T was created. F.A.S.T is the implementation team for the goals and recommendations in the blueprint, which I'm going to take you through. By the way, the entire report is on the website. It's fastinitiative.org. It's over 300 pages. It's quite good, but if you don't have time to read the full report, there's an executive summary, which is also quite good. And I would really recommend you to have a look at it. I'm going to take you through some of it in the next half an hour or so. So the F.A.S.T goals, there are 5 of them. And there are 30 recommendations that are evenly distributed among the 5 goals. And I mention this because those of you who are actually involved in project planning and project management, if your institutions are going to develop and implement anti-trafficking programs, the way the goals and the recommendations are laid out can be your framework for a project plan. It's like turnkey. It's beautiful. You can take it and you can model your project plan on the goals as you wish. I mean, you can devote whatever priorities you decide to each respective goal. But you've got the goals, you've got the act now, you've got the initiate recommendations, and that can be a detailed project plan following the format. I'm going to spend most of my time today speaking about goal number 1, compliance with laws against modern slavery and human trafficking. It's what many of you do on a day-to-day basis. In a moment, I'm going to show you a resource that is in the blueprint. You can access it through the blueprint, and it is the most current and the largest international compendium of published red flags for transaction monitoring, and also published customer account and transaction attributes that you can use to enhance your training programs. You can use them to build your typologies, your automated monitoring, and your investigative procedures. I'll show you that just in a moment. I would mention, by the way, that with the recent legislation passed by the US Congress and the recent notice of proposed rulemaking, the comment period ended for FinCEN's notice, where they are looking at redefining the term of effective compliance programs, AML compliance programs, that there's a lot of room for good ideas, information sharing, public-private partnerships in connection with this goal number 1. Goal number 2, I will speak about, and it's something I feel strongly about, and near the end of the presentation, I'll talk more about it. But it has to do with risk assessments. Now, most of you, maybe all of you, are familiar with AML risk assessments. But if I were going to do an audience poll, and unfortunately, we don't have the ability to do that now because we're not live, but if I were to poll the audience and ask you how many of you are in financial institutions where you have AML risk assessments, I would get yeses from everybody. And basically, but if I were to then change the question and say, how many of those risk assessments actually assess the risks of your organization, risks of being connected to human trafficking? There would be fewer yeses. Your AML risk assessments typically, it's not everybody, but typically, they are not drilling down with that kind of detail to the risks of human trafficking. And even fewer of the institutions do an assessment to see whether the institution itself is connected to human trafficking. So for example, large banks, some of you work for large banks. You have large asset management lines of business. Is your asset management line of business investing in companies that have trafficked labor in their supply chains? Are your corporate and commercial lending programs, which are doing very sophisticated credit risk assessments, are they doing a trafficking assessment before investing in a large construction project? Say the World Cup soccer tournament that's going to be held in Qatar. The US and European banks have opened credit lines of hundreds of millions of dollars. You know that the credit risk assessments were sophisticated, but has anybody done a risk assessment about trafficked labor in the construction projects in those supply chains? The answer is no, and my view and the Commission's view is that that should change. And I will show you a tool in the blueprint that you can use as a model to build this type of risk assessment. It goes well beyond the AML risk because it is specifically geared toward human trafficking. The third goal, I will not have time today to address it, but have a look in the blueprint. It's an interesting discussion. The fourth goal talks about providing and enabling effective remedy for modern slavery and human trafficking harms. There, I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but let me just mention that we have something called the Survivor Inclusion Initiative. Some of you are with banks that are participants. You've heard of it. For those of you who haven't heard of it, let me tell you what it is. It's a consortium of banks that we brought together. We matched them with a group of victim service providers. And we created this consortium because we all understood early on that trafficking victims typically have their identities hijacked by the traffickers. And if they are fortunate enough to escape the trafficker, they find when they try to open a bank account or get an apartment or get a job, that their credit histories have been destroyed. And of course, it's not their fault. The trafficker was using their identity to launder money, to commit fraud, to commit identity theft and the like. But the survivors find that they cannot reintegrate into mainstream financial services, that maybe they can't get an apartment or a job or rent a car. And of course, that makes them more vulnerable to being re-victimized. So we brought together this consortium of banks that agreed to open basic savings and checking accounts for confirmed survivors of trafficking. The idea being that it would help them reintegrate into mainstream financial services. It would make them less vulnerable to being re-victimized. I'm very pleased to be able to share with you that in the year that we've been running the program, we have opened more than 1,800 accounts. I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but we have opened more than 1,800 accounts. One bank in particular actually views this target market as an important one to expand to things like education loans, life insurance. Some of them are starting to issue debit cards and credit cards. So, and financial literacy is something that we're also exploring with some of these banks and their customer bases and with the service providers. So this Survivor Inclusion Initiative as part of Goal 4 is a really great success story, and 1,800 well-deserving people have been helped by this initiative. Investment in innovation for prevention is Goal 5. We will not have time to talk about that one. But again, you can look at the executive summary. This is a slide from the report. You see here the 40.3 million estimated to be in modern slavery. It ranks as one of the top 3 international crimes with drug trafficking and counterfeiting. Here you see some of the numbers again. In the upper right, you see the number in the UK, £328,000, which is the estimated annual cost to the UK government from each case. This slide is important, and besides being interesting, it's important. Why is it important? Because for those of you who are developing rules-based monitoring to find trafficking red flags, here are 9 data points. You can take each of these industries and you can incorporate this by referencing the SIC code. You can incorporate this into your new account onboarding process, which in turn can be accessed by your transaction monitoring systems. And these can inform a risk-based, rules-based, as opposed to typologies-based, a risk-based, rules-based transaction monitoring program for human trafficking. So have a look at this slide, think it through. Obviously, not every wholesale and trade company is involved in trafficking. Not every construction firm is involved in trafficking. Not every mining company is involved. But to the extent that you can find the SIC codes and build it into your onboarding programs, you can actually have a quantitative basis or more of a quantitative basis for your risk-based transaction monitoring. Let me step to the side for a moment and just clear up some one legal issue that Many of you know, some of you don't, and it's worth spending just a couple of minutes. The difference between trafficking and smuggling. They can be related crimes, but they aren't the same. And it's important to understand the difference for at least two reasons. First of all, if you're building automated transaction monitoring tools, you need to understand what the system is actually looking at, because you don't want to be asking the system to look for something that is indicative of the other crime. The second reason is, if you're filing SARs, it's important that your narratives describe what you're seeing accurately. So the basic difference is that smuggling, and for those of you who know this, we're just going to spend a minute on it. We won't spend a lot of time, but as I say, it is important to understand the difference. Smuggling involves a crime being committed against a country's border. The smuggled person has consented to being smuggled. The smuggled person is typically free to leave and free to choose employment after arrival in the country. It's a crime being committed against the border of a country, and typically the person involved is consenting to being involved in that crime, whereas trafficking does not require any actual movement. Of course, you can be trafficked, you can be smuggled rather, and then trafficked, but it doesn't require any movement. It can be entirely domestic. The key to trafficking is that there are elements of force, fraud, or coercion. Those are the key elements in proving the crime. And then there's subsequent involuntary servitude. If you're building rules that looks at sex trafficking, it's important to understand how that differs from the crime of prostitution. In the former, there are elements of force, fraud, or coercion, with limited or no freedom of movement, with limited or no freedom to leave, and limited or no control over earnings, unlike with the latter. And as I said, you need to understand these differences when you're designing your monitoring rules, when you are putting your narrative together in your SAR, and when you're training your investigators. They should know what they're looking at. Okay, this is not in the blueprint, but write down globalincidentmap.com. It's a great resource. If you look at it in your own time, you can see down in the bottom right, there's a legend, and there's actually scrolling news in real time 24/7. It just continues to scroll from all around the world on various trafficking cases, ranging from civil actions for damages against trafficking rings to arrests and prosecutions and asset forfeitures. And it breaks it out. You can see the legend is still here. Slavery, prostitution, organ trafficking, and human smuggling by geography. So that's globalincidentmap.com. I thought I would include it because it's interesting. So go on the website, you can have a look. Okay, so compliance with laws is goal one, and that's where I'm going to spend most of my time. The goal says enforce the ban on modern slavery and human trafficking by strengthening compliance with existing laws. And we list 5 areas. There's not enough time today to go through all 5. I'll spend most of my time on AML, but I did mention sanctions before, and the blueprint does call for more use of sanction regimes to designate traffickers. In goal 1, you see the act now, which is, it contains 3 recommendations. I'll talk about the first one, strengthening financial investigations, and the initiate. I'll talk about the first one, developing transactions analysis tools. And here, I will take you to a tool that's in the blueprint. It is a compendium of resources. It's the most current and most comprehensive catalog of source materials from all around the world, public documents on red flags, published by intergovernmental organizations, by national FIUs, by NGOs, by the private sector. And it provides a model for how you can design your program, because it shows the red flags for designing your transaction monitoring, but it also provides behavioral red flags, observational red flags that you can use to train your customer-facing employees. So for example, and I'll show you some examples, when a teller recognizes a red flag, that's not using automation, that's not using transaction monitoring alerting, that's someone in your someone in your employee pool, staff member who has taken training and who is recognizing that there may be a trafficking victim in front of him or her. So let me take you to this compendium, and here we're going to share the screen. Okay, so Sam, can you just, good, you can see it, terrific. So this was published in 2019 by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, affiliated with the Blueprint, and it's called Following the Money, and it is what I described it as, a compendium of resources and step-by-step guide to financial investigations related to trafficking in human beings. And you can see, it'll take forever to scroll through this. Let me take you. Yeah. So here you see at Appendix A, it's got high-risk business types, which again, you can incorporate not only into training for investigators, but into your onboarding process to risk rank certain types of businesses. So you can see here manual labor, the agricultural industry, construction industry, landscaping. Many of these are non-unionized, subject to few, if any, controls, and they're higher risk for labor trafficking, janitorial services, and the like. Business types, food and service. So of course, this is not saying that all restaurants are using trafficked labor. It's not saying that at all, but it is a foundational document for risk ranking some of your customer base in terms of risk of labor or sex trafficking. And you can use it, as I said, for training investigators and for building monitoring tools. Appendix B is the synthesized financial indicators. And here you have what I was referring to before, the behavioral indicators. So you have coercive behaviors by a trafficker acting on behalf of a victim. And there's a dozen of these that you can use for training your customer-facing personnel. Appearance of potentially trafficked individual. So it's not the behavior of the trafficker, but here it's the behavior of the trafficked person. KYC indicators, so you can build this into your operations, your onboarding, when you are reviewing new accounts, or when you're reviewing alerts. Looking at the KYC indicators to see whether there are indicators, red flags for trafficking, and there are quite a lot of these. And then of course the transactional indicators, which is what we use automation for, using certain types of red flags, and some of these are typology driven. This is a great resource, and you can see there's a lot of these here. Some of it is basic, like cash deposits just under a reporting threshold, so your basic structuring scenarios, cash deposits at several branches or ATMs, looking at the time of day, looking at the type of merchant where the money is being spent, if it's a credit card account. There's a lot of this here, and it is really rich in usable information. So let me go back to the slides. Can you see my slides now? Perfect, great. So staying with this first goal, AML transaction monitoring and SAR filers, I spoke to the OSCE at their plenary session over the summer. There were 57 member countries, and my panel addressed, and my presentation addressed what you see here in italics and underscored, using financial data and financial records to prosecute human trafficking cases is an effective tool in the fight to end trafficking. And we talked about that, and I want to emphasize that for any of you who are relatively new to this. Um, Using financial data and financial records has been effective in identifying victims and perpetrators, improving coercion, which is a required element in the criminal charge, in corroborating witness testimony. You wonder whether your SARs are being used and whether they're useful. Sometimes the SAR narrative, you can't introduce the SAR to trial, but sometimes the SAR narrative, you can figure out a way to use it to corroborate witness testimony, or supporting allegations when a witness does not recall specific dates or transactions. It can serve as the basis for asset forfeitures, which is a very powerful disruptor of the trafficking organization. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. In bringing criminal prosecutions, the government can use the narratives in SARs to highlight the trafficker's motives or to demonstrate the trafficker's knowledge of the initial illegal activity and consciousness of guilt. The SARs can also identify co-conspirators by showing where and to whom the money was transferred, and can also identify additional victims. And if the witnesses are reluctant to testify, typically because of a threat of violence against them or family members, or the risk of being deported, or even because of the fear of being prosecuted themselves, the reports can be used to pursue other criminal charges that may not require testimony. So for example, the government can bring a case against a trafficker for tax evasion or for structuring and money laundering, where the trafficker's tax returns report minimal income, minimal assets, yet the financial records refute those tax returns by illustrating a lavish lifestyle. So I had talked about asset forfeiture, and it's important to keep in mind that crimes such as money laundering, tax evasion, bank fraud, kidnapping, extortion, identity theft, immigration fraud, all of these can be related to trafficking. They can be pursued even when you can't pursue a trafficking charge if the facts support it. And they're all they all provide the basis for asset forfeiture. And you can see here that asset forfeiture is pretty broad in the US. It can include real property, so the traffickers' homes, restaurants, stores, hotels, farms, office parks. It can include tangible personal property, so cash and jewelry and art collections and boats and airplanes and fancy cars, and intangible personal property. So it can include professional licenses. It can include bank and investment accounts, business entities and business permits, website domain names, and also virtual currency. It is a very powerful tool to disrupt the trafficker's business. So goal 2 is knowing and showing risk. And I mentioned that a little while back. I talked about how it is industry practice to conduct AML and OFAC risk assessments on which your risk-based programs are based. But few institutions actually have a mechanism for assessing their exposure to human trafficking, either directly or through their customers. So directly, are your banks contracting with entities that employ low-wage and low-skilled workers? And indirectly, are you providing credit facilities to companies with trafficked labor in their supply chains? So I gave the example of the construction loans, but manufacturing, textiles. And by the way, what about your personal exposure? If you're wearing a cotton shirt, which you probably are, does it come from trafficked labor? Because 70% of where we get our cotton imported from used to come from child labor and trafficked labor. There are horrendous stories about the seafood industry in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean about slave labor used to catch seafood in international waters where none of the governments want to take any jurisdiction. They want to look the other way. after the slaves are no longer useful, either because they've gotten sick or injured, they're thrown overboard. This is very cold. And yet that seafood is exported into the United States. It's at the restaurants where we have lunch and dinner. If it's not of the quality to be at the restaurants, it's in pet food. And many of the large pet food, pet chains may have pet food that has some of the seafood that was caught by trafficked labor. There are some really chilling, very disturbing accounts of the seafood industry, again, in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean. The New York Times did a 4-part series on that. It's worth reading. But the point is, minerals in corporate laptops. You know, your company buys 5,000 laptops. If you're at a big company, you buy 5,000 at a time. Do those laptops have minerals that were extracted by child labor? And the answer is very few of you actually know. And we can fix that. We can expand the concept of doing a risk assessment to include direct and indirect exposure to trafficking, which is different from what we traditionally do, which is we look to see whether the monies are flowing through the accounts. So how do we do that? Well, there's a connection diagnostic and risk mapping tool in the blueprint, and I will show it to you now. In a moment. There it is. So if you go to the FASTinitiative.org website, you'll see up at the top, you can see here, Sam, you can see my cursor, yeah? So you'll see a link to Toolkit. This financial investigations tool link is the OSCE document I took you through a moment ago. What I'm gonna take you through now is the connection and risk tool. And this is actually a model for you to begin to understand your institution's exposure to trafficking and to trafficking victims and what you can do about it. It's interactive. It's a very user-friendly. So first, you're identifying high-scale risks. And Sam, you can see the slide that I'm on. Okay. So first, we identify heightened risks, and we click on Tell Me More. So does your business operate in locations or contexts where the risks of modern slavery are especially high? And maybe the answer is no, but maybe the answer is it's possible, I'm not exactly sure. So is your business associated with high-risk products or service categories? And then you're given some examples. And maybe your answer is it's possible. So is your business linked to high-risk entities? Have you examined sanctions lists, government reporting registers, civil society research publications, or media reports? So it's possible. Are there high-risk labor or recruitment arrangements in your business operations? I mentioned this earlier, or in the operations of businesses with which you have a relationship. So for example, do you rely heavily on a foreign subsidiary or third-party labor brokers, or migrant or refugee labor? They may not provide employment contracts in workers' native language. It may be debt bondage, where wage inflation may not keep pace with general inflation. You get the idea. So there are a series of questions here. Do you operate in a market or value chain with high risk factors? I'm just going to go through these quickly. If you answered yes, or it's possible, you may be facing a high scale risk. So this is trying to identify the scale of it. Then we're going to look at the scope and whether it's remediable. And we go to Tell Me More. And I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. We're almost out of time. So I won't take you through all of this, but there are various factors to consider. You can see how user-friendly this is. And when you're ready, you click on Ready. It will tell you about different types of connections whether it's direct causation, whether it's contribution, or whether it's linkage. And I'm going to finish here on this tool because we're going to run out of time, but you get the idea. You can go through this and you can figure out the nature and scope of your actual risk and what you can do about it. So I will take that and we'll go back to the slides. Can you see the slides? Good. So one last word on risk assessments, and that is that most people forget, and that most people includes a lot of governments, that human trafficking has been known to be a funding source for terrorist organizations. FATF reported that, the UN reported that in ISIS-controlled territory, Yazidi women were being bought and sold by ISIS fighters in slave auctions via the internet. And then FATF did report that you could buy a slave for approximately $13 each. And they were transferred between ISIS fighters as commodities. We know what that means. This is extraordinary. And most of the anti-trafficking initiatives have historically not focused on the terror connection. Boko Haram, they were in the news just a few weeks ago, having kidnapped all those school children. But you'll recall just a couple of years ago when they kidnapped 360 girls from the school, and they are subjected to domestic servitude, forced labor, sex slavery, forced marriages, and the like. And my view is that, this is from the FATF report, human trafficking is likely used as a tool to exploit and control vulnerable local populations as a perceived benefit for fighters in conflict and as an occasion to secure ransom payments. My view is that we should not overlook human trafficking as a funding mechanism for terrorism. So the last goal is the effective remedy. I had talked about the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, and the Survivor Inclusion Initiative. Initially, we rolled it out in Canada, the UK, the US, and Austria, which gave us some coverage for Central and Eastern Europe as well. I hope that in the future we will extend it through Latin America and Africa and Asia. But right now, these were the original jurisdictions. Let me just show you the participating banks. Okay, can you see my screen, Sam? Yeah, good. So Ally Bank is our newest, and of course they are an internet bank. They do not do face-to-face account openings, which is different from, say, Bank of America, which has an extensive branch network. So we have all sorts of banks participating: Bank of the West, Barclays, BMO Financial, Citi, HSBC, LCNB, Scotiabank. Scotia was the first bank in North America to open an account. They did it the week that we announced the program at the UN in 2019. Truist, US Bank, and Wells Fargo. HSBC deserves the shout out. They have been really the trailblazers in the UK. And here you can see the survivor support organizations. I'm going to finish up by leaving you with 8 quick recommendations through the lens of FAST Goal 1, which is the AML compliance and law enforcement goal. I'll give you these 8 recommendations for you to think about in the context of the overall blueprint and the FAST initiative. Number 1, make greater use of the asset forfeiture laws. If that requires legislative or regulatory changes, they should be evaluated and discussed. And by the way, those of you in law enforcement, you know this, but those of you who aren't, maybe you don't know that there's actually a very significant difference in the US between criminal asset forfeiture and civil. In the civil asset forfeiture, it does not require a prior conviction of the trafficker. The Jeffrey Epstein case, for example, there's never going to be a conviction because he's not going to go to trial because he's no longer available. But the government is still going after the townhouses, the boats, the planes, and the other property, which is quite substantial. So civil asset forfeiture can be a very powerful tool. Number two, consider expanding the ability of using the forfeited assets to provide victim services and other appropriate remedies to survivors. Number three, expand the scope of prosecution to facilitators. So that is the people or businesses that assist, enable, aid, or financially benefit from the trafficking. As long as they have knowledge that what they're doing is assisting, enabling, aiding, or they're going to benefit from, there should be consideration of prosecuting them as well. Four, developing global standards for cryptocurrency and the dark web. There's some good progress being made here, and I think FinCEN deserves a lot of credit for what they're trying to do in the crypto space, but it's not consistent around the world. There are still gaps outside of the US in the cryptocurrency space. Of course, ATII is doing some again, trailblazing, groundbreaking work in looking at the dark web and looking at crypto transactions. But there is a need for global minimum standards, and there's a need for more law enforcement sharing, information sharing with the industry. And there too, there are some good initiatives underway. And I would again point out that I think FinCEN is doing good work in this area, facilitating these information exchanges. Number five, always consider using expert witnesses in your case. Use psychologists, medical professionals, social workers, victim advocates. Sam, I think this will intrigue you, to explain to the judge and the jury why victims might recant their testimony, or why they might minimize or change their story, or omit or withhold information, and why they're reluctant to testify against their traffickers. The point is, you should use the experts to explain unfamiliar language and slang regarding the sex trade, especially in electronic communications and text messages. You'll see communications between a trafficker and the victim may be primarily in text messages, and the content of those messages can be used to demonstrate to the jury that the traffickers controlled all aspects of the victim's life. And this is to rebut the defense that the relationship was consensual. And you'll show, for example, texts in which the victim asked permission to eat, to sleep, to work, to take bathroom breaks, etc. Number six, evaluate whether certain businesses that are higher risk for sex trafficking or labor trafficking should be required to post hotline signs. So at hotels, agricultural labor contractors, adult entertainment services, airports, train stations, bus stations, hospitals, urgent care centers, and the like, rest areas, truck stops, massage services. They're all examples of higher risk businesses. There are some groups that are doing great work in this area, posting signs and providing services, Truckers Against Trafficking, ECPAT, but there are opportunities here to do more. It's an effective way to rescue victims. Number seven, and there's just this one and one more, and then we're done. Encourage financial institutions to conduct a periodic risk assessment to evaluate their exposure to trafficking. So I've talked about this a fair amount over this past hour. This goes beyond the traditional AML and sanctions risk assessment. Banks are already accustomed to assessing their financial crime risks, but few evaluate the specific risk that their products and services will be utilized by traffickers, as I pointed out before. And you could look at some of the industries where your banks, on the corporate and commercial side, which is typically not where you're doing your surveillance, they are lending to companies in the extractive industries, oil and minerals. They're lending to companies with extensive supply chains where there are subcontractors who may have trafficked labor. They're lending to companies in construction. And this goes way beyond the traditional retail-oriented approach. The risk assessments, there's a real opportunity to do more. Yeah, this is the fatter point about the connection to between trafficking and terror financing. And immigration relief, this is our last slide. immigration relief for confirmed victims whose immigration status creates a fear of deportation. This will encourage more victims to testify at trials. It will enhance the relationships between victims and law enforcement, and is a more humane way to treat survivors. And I'll just read that last one again. It's a more humane way to treat these people. It is important to pursue capacity building through information sharing. There are more and more public-private partnerships springing up, sharing emerging typologies, again, like ATII does. These are good things. It's important to pursue the capacity building through more training. And we should build on lessons learned in the drug treatment courts, in the domestic violence courts, in the mental health courts, to bring trauma-informed responses to the unique needs of this vulnerable population. So if a 13-year-old girl is arrested for prostitution, it doesn't do anybody any good for her to be bouncing around in the criminal justice system. There are more effective ways to disposition those types of arrests, especially when they're involving a minor, especially when you may have substance abuse issues, and there are precedents for figuring that out. The drug treatment courts, the domestic violence courts, mental health courts, they can bring trauma-informed responses to this vulnerable population. So that's the F.A.S.T initiative, which is the implementation plan for the blueprint issued by the Financial Sector Commission. And I hope that you'll take the blueprint and that you'll find it informative in concrete ways as you build and enhance your own programs. Sam, I will hand it back to you.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Barry. Always the professor. And it's so great when the way you break things down. So I just want to follow up with y'all. We will let you know some more information about the F.A.S.T initiative in time. So stay plugged in with ATII even long after Summit. And thank you all for tuning in today.